Guys, what's going on? I hope you guys are well. I hope you guys are staying safe. I hope everything's good wherever you are. I hope you guys are keeping well, staying safe. I hope you guys are doing very, very well. Beef, raw beef. There's beef kicking off on Twitter. It seems to be where a lot of the beef, the real raw beef, keeps kicking off on the internet between fighters. Andre SOG Ward says that Gennady Golovkin, aka Little G, ducked him in his when he wanted the fight. He goes, I offered Golovkin the fight, and Golovkin didn't want that smoke. He didn't want that smoke. GGG came straight back at Andre Ward saying, Andre, stop lying. Stop lying, Andre. Stop lying. Stop lying to the people, Andre. And then Andre Ward came back and said, Golovkin, I have receipts to prove it. We all know that Andre Ward wanted to fight Gennady Golovkin. We all know that Andre Ward was chasing the big fight, the marquee names. Andre Ward never had the big names in his division. You know, he had guys like Kessler, Froch, but these guys were a level below Andre Ward, and he needed some stiff competition. And he started calling out Gennady Golovkin because people thought Gennady Golovkin could be that dude to beat Andre SOG Ward. And for me, that would have been a very tough fight for Andre Ward. That would have been his toughest fight, you know, because Froch and Kessler, those guys were good, but they didn't cut it against Andre Ward. Golovkin would have been a different ball game altogether. You know, Golovkin had great feet. He was a great pressure fighter. He was a great puncher. Froch and Kessler, they were good, but they were a bit sloppy with their punches. They were very readable. They were a bit more one-dimensional. And someone like Andre Ward was just a bit too sharp. Golovkin's a different ball game because Golovkin's got a granite chin. And he walks forward, and for me, he's just a more sharper, just a better boxer than both those guys, and he hits harder in my opinion, and he's also a lot more crisp in the way he lands. He also puts you under a lot more pressure. I believe that that would have been a very, very tough fight. You know, look, the comment, look, I think most of us would say that Andre Ward wins that fight. But I think that wouldn't have been an easy fight for Andre Ward. Styles make fights. I think Triple G's pressure, Triple G's power, I think that could have caused Andre Ward a lot of trouble. Andre Ward was the bigger man. He knew how to control. He knew how to spoil and hold and grab, and, you know, he knew all of that. Andre Ward was a master, and Andre Ward had great boxing IQ. He was a very, very intelligent man inside that boxing ring. He was a very, 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 very gifted fighter, and not just that, a very smart fighter. But Golovkin could have done Andre Ward. Look, I think it would have been a good fight. I would have favored Ward, but that would have been a tough fight. You know, that wouldn't have been an easy fight. I think people would automatically say Andre Ward wins that, but I don't think that would have been as easy as what people think. Styles make fights at world level. And I think Golovkin had the jab. I think Golovkin had the foot speed. I think Golovkin had the cutting off. He knew how to cut off the ring. That wouldn't have been an easy fight, you know, Golovkin had serious power. I would have favored Ward in that one, just because I think Ward was the bigger man. Kovalev did, however, give Andre Ward a lot of trouble. Kovalev had different dimensions. Kovalev was bigger. Kovalev was a very big puncher as well. And Andre Ward never had an easy fight. I thought he lost the first fight, and then Andre Ward came back, adjusted, and he beat Kovalev in the second fight. You know what? That Golovkin fight was a fight that I really wanted to see. And this is what I said about Golovkin, that I feel like Golovkin hurt his career a little bit, because Golovkin could have easily fought Andre Ward. Golovkin, in my opinion, should have looked to explore that option. But I personally think that Golovkin was looking for that Canelo Alvarez fight. So Golovkin didn't want to go up and fight Andre Ward, because if he loses, then he knows the biggest payday of his career, which would have been against Alvarez, because Alvarez was a much bigger name than Ward, would have meant that he would have probably lost that payday against Canelo Alvarez, because would Canelo Alvarez then have fought him if he lost to Andre Ward? Possibly not. So Gennady Golovkin played it smart. He ended up getting two big paydays with Saul Canelo Alvarez. So I think it was a smart move, and he probably thought he had a much better chance of beating Saul Canelo Alvarez, because Saul Canelo Alvarez was a smaller guy, and Golovkin was favorite. I think many people thought that Golovkin would beat Canelo. So I think Golovkin played a smart one there, but did Golovkin duck the fight? I don't know, because at the end of the day, we don't know what the ins and outs are. But if I'm honest with you, I think Andre Ward probably wanted the Golovkin fight more. You know, Golovkin's a warrior, but in my personal humble opinion, I think Andre Ward probably wanted that fight more, because when you look, Golovkin was a massive name. He was becoming a big star, and Andre Ward had no competition. Now Andre Ward had to move up to fight Kovalev. I'm pretty sure Andre Ward would have stayed at 168 to fight Gennady Golovkin. But the thing is, with Gennady Golovkin said to Carl Froch that he was willing to fight Carl Froch at 168, but then he was talking about Ward fighting him at a catchweight. And I think that's when it got a bit mucky and a bit messy from their end, because the reports that were coming out, it looked like Golovkin was the one that looked like he was avoiding Ward. Now, I don't know the ins and outs. We don't know. Loeffler also agreed, but Loeffler is the promoter of Gennady Golovkin, and he said that I agree with Gennady, because Gennady came back and said that I wasn't ducking you. That's a lie. Stop lying. But to be honest with you, who's saying the truth? We don't know. I just think that if I would take a side, probably Andre Ward, because Andre Ward needed that fight. Let's be honest. Andre Ward needed Golovkin. He needed that fight with Golovkin, because Andre Ward didn't really have much competition out there, right? Who did Andre Ward have to fight? Andre Ward never really had many names. He had to actually eventually move up and fight the man at light heavyweight. So for me, Andre Ward would have taken the Golovkin fight in a heartbeat, because he didn't have competition. Whereas Gennady Golovkin was looking out for the Canelo Alvarez fight. So did it really make sense for Gennady Golovkin to go up and fight Andre Ward? Probably not. Hence why I do kind of think that maybe Gennady Golovkin didn't want to fight Ward. But who knows? Who knows? I really like Golovkin. I honestly think that Ward fight was a fight that he could have won. It would have been a tough fight, but I don't think that would have been an easy fight for Andre Ward. I think styles make fights. I think Golovkin would have been even more dangerous than Canelo, just because of the fact that Golovkin has a pressure fighting style. And that would have been troublesome for Ward. And he's not just a pressure fighter, Golovkin. He's very accurate with his punches. He's not wild. He's very smart. He cuts off the ring. He closes gap. Like, Golovkin's a very, very good fighter. So that for me would have been a very difficult fight. That for me would have been a very, very difficult fight for Andre Ward. I think people sometimes don't realize how good Golovkin was. People just think he's one-dimensional walking forward. Golovkin was a lot better than that. Golovkin was a special fighter. People don't seem to give Golovkin the credit and don't seem to give Golovkin the flowers. Golovkin was a tremendous fighter, not just a puncher, not just a wild puncher. Golovkin cut off the ring. He had very educated feet. He could cut off the ring very well. He would suffocate you. He'd make you, it'd suffocate you and put a lot of mental and physical pressure on you. Golovkin was an animal, man. I don't see how I just don't understand why people don't seem to give Golovkin his credit. Like, I've seen people, talk about Golovkin like he was just some kind of wild puncher. No, absolutely not. Golovkin was very, very skilled fighter, a very, very good fighter. He was an unbelievable talent. There's a reason why a lot of people were avoiding Gennady Golovkin. They weren't avoiding him because, he wasn't a big star. No. They were avoiding him because he was dangerous. And they knew that, this guy could beat us. Don't get it twisted. People were avoiding Golovkin because Golovkin was dangerous. They didn't want to go near that dude. They didn't want to go near him. But Golovkin at the same time didn't go up and fight Andre Ward because I reckon he probably knew that fight was tough. Now, obviously, we don't know what the truth is, but I just think that Golovkin had Canelo Alvarez and he knew that fight would eventually happen. So Golovkin, in my opinion, didn't want to risk that fight by going up and fighting Andre Ward because he knew that the Andre Ward fight wouldn't be as big money as the Canelo fight. So for me, Golovkin played a smart business move there. And also, he probably felt more confident in beating Canelo than Andre Ward because Andre Ward was bigger than him. And Andre Ward was the type of guy that he can nullify you and, he's very good at nullifying guys. So Andre Ward was very good at that. So maybe Golovkin was more confident in beating Canelo. But I think Golovkin would have given Andre Ward a lot of trouble. A lot of trouble. A lot of trouble. I would have loved to see that fight. Gennady Golovkin for me was a special talent. So was Andre Ward. But both guys really didn't get... Like, Golovkin got the opportunities. I felt like he got the opportunities a bit late. The same with Andre Ward. Andre Ward was a guy, he just didn't really have the competition in his weight class. I think the super middleweight division wasn't the greatest division in the world. I didn't think there was many fighters. There were some good world-class fighters, like I mentioned, Froch, Kessler. But they weren't the elite fighters in that division, in my opinion. And the elite fighter that he fought was Sergey Kovalev. And I think we could clearly see that the performance, it was a lot harder for him. And for me, Golovkin would have been the same. It's just that Golovkin was smaller, so maybe Ward might have been able to handle him a lot easier. But personally, I think Andre Ward at 168 was just too dominant. I don't think he had the dance partners, unfortunately, in that weight division. He just didn't have, he didn't have the depth of talent really to test him. He didn't have a Joe Calzaghe. He didn't have a Roy Jones. He didn't have a Bernard Hopkins. He didn't have those type of guys. He eventually found his match in Sergey Kovalev. But that's why Andre Ward was looking for your Golovkins. He was looking for the Canelos. He was looking for these type of names so he can be tested, because Gennady Golovkin was an elite fighter. He was definitely elite, and at 160, he was a monster at that weight. And I think he would have. I think he would have been a monster at 168. This is why I always question why Golovkin never ever moved up. Why Golovkin stayed in one weight division. There's nothing wrong with that. Marvin Hagler did that. There's nothing wrong in staying in one weight division. I just felt like Golovkin was capable of moving up and doing well in other weight divisions as well. So this is why it surprised me that Golovkin never moved up. It just doesn't make sense, especially the fact that Golovkin was a fighter his whole career that couldn't get the big fights, and then he eventually did towards the back end. He got Jacobs, he got Canelo. But if you look at it, who were the real top names that Golovkin's fought in his career? Jacobs and Canelo, really. And even Jacobs, he's a good fighter, but he's not like, the only fight he really got was the big name on, Canelo, really. That's it. Whereas if he had fought Andre Ward, that would have been another massive name on his record. Do you see what I mean? So I feel like Golovkin, for me, didn't really get, maybe he could have gone up to light heavy and fought Sergey Kovalev. Do you see what I mean? I feel like Golovkin didn't really get the big names. He didn't really get the big fights, but I think some of it's down to himself as well. The fact that there was not much competition at 160, there wasn't many big names there. So there was a guy at 168 in Andre Ward, which he could have fought. So you have to question some of Golovkin's decision making. You have to think, why was that not done? Was he just waiting? Was he chasing Canelo? Was he just waiting for that? Who knows? But I definitely think that Golovkin could have fought. I definitely think Golovkin could have fought Andre Ward. I think that was a brilliant fight. But leave your thoughts, guys. Who would have won that fight if they had fought? Who would you have favored in that fight? Would you have favored Golovkin? Would you have favored Andre Ward? Personally, I would edge towards Ward. But I would, like I said, I think Golovkin was a live fighter in that fight. I think Golovkin could have won. I'm telling you, Golovkin was a serious force. He was a serious force. Hence why I feel like that fight should have happened. I think he was a serious force. It wouldn't even shock me if he pulled it off. Because I love Golovkin. I think Golovkin was a special fighter. He just didn't get, the names on his record, to prove how great he was, unfortunately. Look, I think he beat Canelo the first time. So that just shows you, anyone that's able to give Canelo those type of fights shows you how great he was. So leave your thoughts, guys. Let me know what you think in the comment section below, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.